The first thing I heard after my stroke was my daughter's voice whispering to someone in the hallway. "Just make sure she understands there's nothing left," she said quietly. "The money is gone anyway." I kept my eyes closed. When you're 68 and wake up after a stroke, people assume two things: that you're fragile and that you're confused. That morning, I was neither. My name is Margaret Ellison, and 14 months before that moment, I was worth a little over $4 million. Not old family money, not lottery money. Real money. The kind built slowly through contracts, property, and 40 years of refusing to let men in gray suits tell me what I couldn't do. Yet there I was, lying in a rehabilitation bed that smelled faintly of antiseptic and boiled cabbage, listening to my own daughter explain to a nurse that I had no money left. The nurse asked gently, "Are you sure she understands?" "She will," my daughter replied. "Mom's not the same anymore. Not the same." I nearly smiled, because the truth was something they hadn't considered. A stroke scrambles many things: words, balance, memory. But it does not erase the instincts that built an empire. And even before I opened my eyes, something about their story already felt wrong. "Hello, my dear friends. It's Grace. I'm glad you're here today. Hearing your own children talk about you like you're already gone, that kind of coldness cuts deep. Tell me honestly, if you woke up to this, would you stay quiet or confront them immediately?" When I finally opened my eyes, the room was quiet. Morning light slid through pale curtains, turning everything a dull yellow. The metal railings, the plastic water pitcher, the tiny tray where someone had left a bowl of oatmeal, already forming a thin gray skin on top. My right arm felt heavy, my tongue even heavier. But my mind? Sharp. A nurse noticed I was awake and rushed over. She spoke slowly, the way people speak to toddlers and the elderly. "Good morning, Mrs. Ellison. Do you know where you are?" I looked at her, then at the ceiling, then back at her. "Rehabilitation," I croaked. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "That's right." She asked a few more questions. The year, the president, whether I could move my fingers. I answered most of them. Not perfectly, but well enough. After she left, the door opened again. My daughter Catherine walked in first, wearing a cream coat that probably cost more than my first car. Behind her came my son Daniel, tall, tense, checking his phone like the room bored him. For a moment, they simply looked at me. Catherine forced a soft smile. "Oh, Mom," she said gently, "you're awake." Her voice had the same tone she used when she was 10, and trying to explain why the neighbor's window had mysteriously shattered. Daniel stepped closer. "How are you feeling?" "Like I was hit by a truck," I rasped. That much at least was honest. Catherine squeezed my hand. "You scared us," she said. But her eyes moved quickly across the room. To the machines, the chart at the end of the bed, the hallway behind us, as if she were checking who might be listening. Then she said the sentence that still rings in my ears. "Mom, there are some things we need to talk about." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Catherine took a breath. "You were very sick for a long time. The stroke was severe. Doctors weren't sure you'd recover." I waited. "And during that time," she continued carefully, "your finances, well, things changed." There it was, the rehearsed speech. "What changed?" I asked slowly. Daniel answered this time. "The market collapsed on a few of your investments. Taxes piled up. Medical bills too. We tried to keep everything afloat, but he spread his hands. There's nothing left. Nothing left. $4.1 million. Gone. I watched their faces. Daniel avoided eye contact. Catherine nodded sympathetically, like a bank teller denying a loan. For a long moment, I said nothing, because something small had already begun scratching at the back of my mind. A memory. A detail. Something Daniel had just said. You see, when you spend decades managing money, your brain stores numbers the way musicians store melodies. And Daniel had just made one mistake, a tiny one, but big enough to tell me this story wasn't simply bad luck. It was a lie. I looked at my children, the two people I had worked my entire life to protect, and realized something colder than anger. They thought the stroke had finished me. They thought I was too weak to question anything, too slow to remember, too broken to fight. What they didn't understand yet was that Margaret Ellison had spent 40 years watching people try to outsmart her, and very few of them had succeeded. I closed my eyes again, pretending exhaustion. Let them think what they wanted, because if my money was truly gone, then I needed to learn exactly where it went. And the best way to catch a thief is to let them believe you're still asleep. For the next 2 days, I played the role they expected. Slow speech, long pauses, confusion at convenient moments. It wasn't entirely an act. A stroke is not a polite visitor. My right leg trembled when I stood, my mouth sometimes refused to form the word I wanted, and once I asked a nurse for water when I meant tea. But confusion about money? That part I kept perfectly hidden. Catherine visited every morning around 10, always dressed neatly, always smelling faintly of bergamot perfume, always carrying the same concerned expression people wear at funerals when they're trying not to check their watches. Daniel came less often. When he did, he stayed near the window, scrolling through his phone as if the world inside that screen mattered more than the one standing in front of him. On the third day, I decided to test them. I remember the house, I said slowly, sitting up in bed while Catherine adjusted my pillow. The one by the lake. Her hands froze for half a second. Then she smiled. We had to sell it, Mom. Remember? After the stroke. Of course. The lake house. I'd bought it 22 years earlier after a brutal merger negotiation in Chicago. I still remembered the smell of cedar from the dock and the ridiculous little copper kettle I used for making lapsang souchong on cold mornings. Selling it would have been inconvenient, but not catastrophic. And the Boston apartment? I asked. Daniel looked up from his phone. Gone too, he said flatly. Catherine nodded, squeezing my hand again. We tried to keep things stable as long as possible. I tilted my head, as if thinking through fog. And the investment accounts? Daniel exhaled loudly. Mom, the markets were a mess. Everything dropped. You had positions we couldn't maintain once the medical bills started stacking up. Interesting. Very interesting. Because the last time I checked, which was 3 days before my stroke, those accounts were structured specifically so they could survive a market crash. I had built them that way after the recession in 2008, which meant one of two things had happened. Either my entire financial structure collapsed in the most spectacularly unlikely way imaginable, or my children were improvising. Catherine leaned closer. You shouldn't stress about this right now, she said softly. What matters is that you're safe. Safe. The word hung in the air like stale smoke. That afternoon, they brought in a speech therapist named Lena. She was younger than the others, maybe 35, with dark hair tied into a loose knot and the sharp, observant eyes of someone who noticed things before speaking. During our session, she placed picture cards on a small table. "Just say the word you see," she said gently. "Apple. Chair. Envelope." My voice cracked on the last one. She nodded, writing something on her clipboard. Then she asked casually, "Do you feel like your thoughts are clear?" I looked at her. "Clear enough," I said. Our eyes held for a moment longer than necessary. She understood something. Not everything, but enough. Later that evening, as the hallway quieted and dinner trays clattered somewhere down the corridor, Lena returned with a cup of tea. "Chamomile," she said. I lifted an eyebrow. "Hospital, luxury." She smiled faintly. "Don't get used to it." She sat down beside the bed, pretending to review her notes. Then, very quietly, she asked something unexpected. "Mrs. Ellison, do you remember how long you were unconscious after the stroke?" "Days," I said. "Longer," she replied. "How long?" She hesitated. "Almost 14 months. The room went silent. 14 months. 14 months of my life erased. 14 months where other people made decisions for me. I stared at the window, watching rain slide down the glass in thin silver lines. 14 months was more than enough time for many things. A divorce, a bankruptcy, a business collapse, or a very careful theft. Lena cleared her throat. "There's something else you should know." My attention returned to her. "Your children told most of the staff that your cognitive recovery might be limited," she said carefully. I felt my stomach tighten. "They said it would be kinder if we didn't overwhelm you with complicated discussions." Complicated discussions. Like bank accounts. Like legal guardianship. Like $4 million disappearing into thin air. I looked down at my hands, still trembling slightly from the stroke. Still weaker than they used to be, but capable. Capable enough. "Lena," I said quietly. "Yes?" "If someone wanted to see my medical file?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether they're supposed to." A slow smile tugged at the corner of my mouth. For the first time since waking up, something inside me felt almost like excitement. Because if my children had truly spent $4.1 million in 14 months, they hadn't just taken my money. They had rewritten my entire life. And rewriting a life requires paperwork. Lots of it. Paperwork leaves trails. And trails led somewhere. I leaned back against the pillow and closed my eyes again. Let them think I was tired. Let them think I was fragile. Let them keep talking in hallways. Because the more comfortable thieves become, the sloppier they get. And sooner or later, someone always forgets to close a door. The next morning, I began counting time differently. Not in hours, in mistakes. Because when people lie repeatedly, the lies start stepping on each other's toes. Catherine arrived first again, right on schedule. 10 o'clock, same coat, same careful smile. She brought a small paper bag from a cafe across the street. "I got you something nicer than hospital food," she said. Inside was a croissant and a small container of apricot jam. I stared at it for a moment. Not because of the pastry, because Catherine hated apricot jam. She used to complain the smell reminded her of cough syrup. Yet now she was bringing it to me like a thoughtful daughter. People performing kindness often forget the details of real memories. "Thank you," I said slowly. She pulled a chair beside the bed. "Daniel might stop by later," she added. "He's been very busy managing everything." Everything. Such a convenient word. I took a bite of the croissant. It was surprisingly good, flaky and warm, probably from that little French bakery 2 blocks from the hospital. Then I asked the question I'd been saving. Who's handling my accounts now? Catherine blinked. Your accounts? Yes. She hesitated just long enough for me to notice. Well, Daniel mostly, she said. And the attorney. Which attorney? Mr. Caldwell? I nearly laughed, because Harold Caldwell had been dead for 3 years. Instead, I frowned slightly, like someone struggling to recall something through fog. Caldwell? Yes. Catherine relaxed. You remember him? Vaguely, I said. She smiled again, satisfied. That was mistake number 1. She stayed another 15 minutes, talking about small things. The weather, the nurses, how proud she was of my progress. Then she kissed my cheek and left. The moment the door closed, I reached for the water on the bedside table and took a slow sip. Harold Caldwell. Dead 3 years, meaning one of 2 things. Either Catherine had no idea who was handling my legal affairs, or she assumed I didn't remember. Around noon, Daniel finally appeared. Unlike his sister, he didn't bother pretending enthusiasm. You look better, he said, leaning against the wall. Feel better, I replied. He nodded once. Silence settled between us. Daniel had always been the quieter of my children. As a boy, he dismantled radios and computers just to see how they worked. As a teenager, he hacked the school network out of boredom. And as an adult, well, adults simply use their talents in more expensive ways. You're making the nurses nervous, he said suddenly. How? You're recovering faster than they expected. There it was. A flicker of honesty. I tilted my head. Is that bad? Daniel studied me carefully. For a moment, I saw the same calculating expression he used during college chess tournaments. No, he said slowly. It's just surprising. Then his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and I caught a glimpse of the screen. A notification banner. From Aston Martin, Stockholm. My eyes moved away before he noticed, but inside my chest, something tightened. Aston Martin. Not exactly the kind of dealership someone visits after losing millions in family finances. Daniel slid the phone back into his pocket. I should go, he said. Before leaving, he added something else. Don't worry about the money, Mom. What matters is that you're taken care of. Taken care of? I nodded politely. After he left, the room felt strangely quiet. Rain had stopped outside and sunlight spilled across the floor in long, pale strips. 14 months. 14 months while I lay somewhere between living and dying. Long enough for my children to sell houses. Long enough to move money. Long enough to tell the world a story about their poor, declining mother. But something about Daniel's face kept bothering me. Not guilt, not fear, confidence. The kind of confidence people only have when they believe the system is already on their side. Later that afternoon, Lena returned for another therapy session. We practiced reading sentences. My speech was improving, slowly. When the exercises ended, she gathered the cards and leaned closer. Your recovery is progressing unusually fast, she said quietly. I've always been stubborn. She smiled slightly. Then her voice dropped. I checked something for you. My attention sharpened. Your children filed an emergency guardianship petition 6 weeks after your stroke. Guardianship. That meant control, medical decisions, financial authority, everything. Approved? I asked. Yes. My throat tightened. Based on what? Lena hesitated. According to the file, your neurologist testified that you were unlikely to regain meaningful cognitive function. meaningful. I looked at my hands again, then at the window, then back at her. That neurologist, I said slowly. Do you know his name? She nodded. Dr. Marcus Lindgren. The name hit me like a cold draft through an open door. Because I knew Dr. Lindgren, not personally, but professionally. 5 years earlier, one of my companies had donated nearly $500,000 to the Neurological Research Foundation he chaired, which meant something else entirely. Dr. Lindgren knew exactly who I was, and if he testified, I would never recover. Then someone had convinced him, or someone had paid him, or someone had lied to him very, very well. I leaned back against the pillow, my mind turning faster now. The pieces were beginning to move. Children with legal control. A doctor declaring me mentally gone. $4 million disappearing in 14 months. And a son receiving notifications from luxury car dealerships. I exhaled slowly, because one thought had just settled firmly into place. This wasn't a messy accident. It was a plan. And plans have architects. The first time I left the rehabilitation room, I nearly collapsed after 12 steps. A stroke teaches you humility in brutal ways. My right leg dragged slightly, and the corridor seemed much longer than it had when I arrived in a wheelchair. Every few steps, my balance wavered, and Lena hovered nearby, pretending she was only observing progress. The hallway smelled faintly of disinfectant and something sweet from the kitchen. Maybe cinnamon porridge. I gripped the metal railing. Slow, Lena said quietly. I am slow. We reached a small sitting area near a window. Someone had placed a dusty ficus plant beside 2 faded armchairs and a little table stacked with old magazines. On the table sat a bowl of wrapped caramels. I lowered myself into one of the chairs. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Lena said, "You've been thinking a lot." I let out a quiet breath. Yes. She looked around the hallway to make sure no one was listening. There's something else in your file you should probably know. I waited. The guardianship request didn't just include the neurologist's testimony. My fingers tightened around the armrest. What else? Financial urgency, she said. Meaning, your children claimed your accounts were collapsing, and that immediate control was necessary to prevent catastrophic losses. Catastrophic losses. $4 million apparently evaporating in 14 months certainly sounded catastrophic. But here's the strange part, Lena added. I looked at her. The documentation supporting that claim was thin. How thin? One letter from a financial advisor and a brief statement from your son. Daniel. Of course. I stared out the window. The sky had cleared and pale sunlight bounced off the wet pavement outside. A delivery van rolled past the entrance, and a nurse laughed somewhere down the hall. Normal sounds. Normal life. Meanwhile, my entire existence had apparently been rewritten on the strength of 2 documents. You said something yesterday, Lena continued carefully, about remembering your finances. I do. Then I need to ask you something directly. She leaned closer. Did you ever give Daniel authority over your accounts before the stroke? No. The answer came instantly. Because that decision had always been simple. Daniel was brilliant with technology, but reckless with money. When he was 26, he spent nearly $80,000 trying to build a cryptocurrency startup with 3 friends and a Labrador retriever that apparently served as their office mascot. I loved my son, but I trusted him with family dinners, not with $4 million. Lena nodded slowly. That's what I suspected. Before I could respond, Footsteps echoed down the corridor. We both looked up. A man in a dark suit was walking toward the nurses' station at the far end of the hall. Tall, silver hair, polished shoes, the quiet confidence of someone used to expensive rooms. He spoke briefly with one of the nurses. Then he glanced down the hallway. Our eyes met. For a split second, recognition flickered across his face. Then he turned away. "Who is that?" I asked quietly. Lena followed my gaze. "Oh," she said, "that's Mr. Hallberg. He's been here a few times." "Why?" "He handles financial matters for some of the residents." Financial matters. I watched him speak to the nurse again. Something about his posture felt familiar. Then it hit me. "Hallberg," I murmured. The name slid through my memory like a key in a lock. Jonas Hallberg, private wealth manager, extremely discreet, extremely expensive, and most importantly, not someone Daniel could afford, not even close. "Lena," I said quietly. "Yes? Did he ever visit me before?" She frowned slightly. "I'm not sure. I'd have to check the visitor log." "Please do." She nodded. A few minutes later, she returned with a tablet used for staff records. Her fingers scrolled down the screen, then stopped. Her eyebrows lifted. "Well," she said softly. "What?" "He visited you 3 times during the first 6 months after your stroke." My pulse quickened. 3 visits, while I was unconscious. "Who signed him in?" I asked. Lena scanned the screen again. Then she turned the tablet slightly so I could see. "Visitor authorization, Daniel Ellison." Of course. But that wasn't the interesting part. The interesting part was the purpose of visit. The screen read, "Financial Transfer Coordination." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Lena asked, "Does that mean anything to you?" Oh, it meant something. It meant Daniel hadn't been guessing. He hadn't been improvising. He'd brought in one of the most meticulous wealth managers in Scandinavia, while I lay unconscious. Which meant the money hadn't simply disappeared into luxury cars and designer kitchens. It had been moved, carefully, professionally, possibly even legally. And that realization changed the shape of everything, because stealing money is messy. But relocating money, that takes planning, precision, and someone who knows exactly how the system works. I leaned back slowly in the chair. My children hadn't just looted my life. They had restructured it. And if Jonas Hallberg was involved, then somewhere out there, my $4 million might still exist. Just not where it used to be. All right, friends. Things just got interesting. This doesn't look like simple greed anymore. If someone hires a wealth manager while their mother is unconscious, that's planning on a different level. Tell me honestly, what would you be thinking right now if you were Margaret? That night, I didn't sleep. Not because of pain, though my shoulder still throbbed when I moved, but because my mind refused to slow down. Jonas Hallberg. The name circled my thoughts like a hawk. In my world, people like Hallberg did not appear casually. They were the financial equivalent of surgeons, expensive, precise, and usually called only when something complicated needed to be handled quietly. Daniel couldn't afford him, which meant one of 2 things had happened. Either Hallberg believed he was acting on my authority, or someone had convinced him that Daniel already controlled my assets. Neither possibility was comforting. At 2 a.m, the rehabilitation wing was nearly silent. Somewhere down the corridor, a machine beeped steadily, and a nurse's footsteps echoed every few minutes like a slow metronome. I sat up carefully, in bed. The room was dim, except for the small lamp beside the window. Outside, the city looked washed clean after the rain, the streetlights reflecting off wet asphalt like scattered gold. 14 months. 14 months while my children moved pieces across the board. I needed information. And information required two things: records and people. The next morning, Lena returned earlier than usual. "You look like you haven't slept," she said. "Thinking," I replied. She pulled a chair beside the bed. "I checked the visitor logs again," she said quietly. "And?" "Jonas Hallberg didn't just visit." My stomach tightened. "What do you mean?" "He had private meetings with your son in one of the administrative offices." "How many?" 5. 5 meetings. That was not casual financial advice. That was a project. "Did the staff know what they were discussing?" I asked. Lena shook her head. "They always listed the same purpose in the system. Financial coordination?" "Of course, carefully vague." "Lena," I said slowly, "have you ever seen my children arguing?" She frowned. "Once, a few weeks ago." My attention sharpened. "About what?" "I wasn't close enough to hear everything," she admitted, "but your daughter sounded upset. Something about Daniel moving things too fast." Moving things. My fingers tapped lightly against the blanket. So Catherine might not know everything. Maybe. That possibility lingered in the air. Because if Catherine didn't know everything, then Daniel might have been running the real operation alone. Or worse. Catherine knew exactly what happened, but wanted to pretend otherwise. Both scenarios were useful, just in different ways. Later that afternoon, Daniel returned. This time he looked slightly more tense. "Physical therapy going well?" he asked. "Slow," I said. He nodded. Then he walked to the window and stared outside for a moment. "Doctors say you're improving faster than expected." "Yes." Silence stretched between us. I watched him carefully. Daniel had always been difficult to read. Even as a boy, he kept his emotions folded neatly inside himself, like letters no one else was allowed to open. Finally, I spoke. "Daniel?" He turned. "Yes?" "Do you remember the copper kettle?" He blinked. "What kettle?" "The one at the lake house. The little one I used for tea." "Oh," he said quickly. "Right." "What happened to it?" He shrugged. "Probably sold with the house." I nodded slowly. That was mistake number 2. Because the kettle had never been at the lake house. It was in the Boston apartment. Daniel didn't notice the trap he'd stepped into. Instead, he pulled his phone from his pocket again. A message flashed briefly across the screen. I caught just enough to read the sender. Hallberg Private Wealth. Daniel locked the phone instantly, but it was too late. I had seen it. He slipped the phone back into his jacket. "I have a meeting," he said. "I'll visit later this week." Then he left. The door closed quietly behind him. I leaned back against the pillow. Hallberg was still in contact, meaning whatever they'd done with my money, it wasn't finished yet. That evening, Lena returned with my therapy schedule for the next week. But instead of placing it on the table, she sat down beside the bed again. "You're planning something," she said. I smiled faintly. "Thinking." She studied me for a moment. Then she said something that surprised me. "My brother works in banking." My eyebrows lifted. "Does he?" "Yes." "Compliance division." "Compliance. The people who investigate suspicious financial activity." "He owes me a favor," she added. The room went very quiet. I looked at her carefully. "You'd risk your job for this?" She shook her head. "I wouldn't risk my job." Then she smiled slightly. but asking a hypothetical question about a large financial transfer isn't against any rules. For the first time since waking up from the stroke, I felt something close to genuine warmth. Because allies rarely arrive with trumpets. Usually they appear quietly, like a speech therapist bringing chamomile tea. "Lena," I said softly. "Yes?" "If $4 million moved through the system in 14 months? She nodded slowly. "There will be traces," she finished. "Exactly. Traces. And if there were traces, then somewhere inside the quiet machinery of banks and accounts and digital records, the truth was waiting. The only question now was how ugly it would be when I finally found it." 2 days later, I finally stepped outside the rehabilitation wing. Not outside the building, I wasn't strong enough for that yet, but into the main lobby of the facility. Lena insisted it was good for environmental stimulation, which sounded like a polite way of saying the world still exists beyond your hallway. The lobby was brighter than the ward upstairs. Tall windows, pale wooden floors, a faint smell of coffee drifting from a small cafe corner where visitors sat, whispering over porcelain cups. Real cups, not plastic. That alone told me this place charged a great deal of money for the illusion of comfort. I moved slowly with my cane, each step deliberate. The stroke still pulled slightly at my right side, like gravity had decided to favor one direction. Lena walked beside me, but kept a respectful distance. "You're doing better," she said. "I'm doing careful." We reached a small seating area near the window. Outside, a thin layer of snow had begun settling across the street. Stockholm in early winter always had that strange, quiet brightness. The sky pale, the air sharp enough to wake every nerve. I lowered myself into a chair. Then I saw her. A young woman sitting at the cafe table across the lobby, staring at me like she'd just seen a ghost. It took a second for recognition to land. "Clara?" I said. She stood so quickly, her chair scraped across the floor. "Grandma?" My granddaughter crossed the room in 3 hurried steps and wrapped her arms around me before Lena could even react. Her coat smelled faintly of cold air and vanilla shampoo. "Grandma, they told me you weren't really awake yet." My eyes moved past her shoulder, across the lobby, where Catherine stood frozen beside the reception desk. Ah, so this visit hadn't been planned. Clara pulled back slightly, studying my face. "You look different," she said softly. "I had a stroke." "I know," she whispered. "But Mom said you barely recognized people." I glanced toward Catherine again. My daughter quickly forced a smile and walked over. "Clara, sweetheart, I was just about to explain." "You said she couldn't talk properly," Clara interrupted. Catherine's smile tightened. "She's improving." Clara looked back at me, confusion written all over her face. "You sound fine." "Mostly." Lena quietly stepped away, pretending to check something at the nurse's station. Smart woman. Family moments can become complicated quickly. Clara sat down beside me. Her eyes were still the same shade of gray they'd been when she was a child sitting at my kitchen counter eating honey cakes straight from the oven. "How long have you been awake?" she asked. "A few days." Her head turned slowly toward Catherine. "A few days?" Catherine cleared her throat. We didn't want to overwhelm her. That phrase again. Overwhelm. Clara didn't look convinced. Then she leaned closer to me. "Grandma, something weird has been going on." My attention sharpened. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, glancing at Catherine. My daughter was suddenly very interested in adjusting the strap of her handbag. Clara lowered her voice. Mom and Uncle Daniel have been different. How? They fight all the time, she said quietly, mostly about money. Catherine looked up sharply. Clara, this is not the place. But Clara kept speaking. And Uncle Daniel bought a new car last month. My pulse slowed. What kind of car? Clara frowned slightly, thinking. British, I think. Dark green. The logo looked like wings. Aston Martin. Daniel hadn't even waited until I woke up. Catherine stepped forward quickly. That was a business purchase, she said. Clara stared at her. Mom? He's not even in the car business. Silence dropped across the lobby. I studied my daughter carefully. Her jaw was tight now. The pleasant daughter mask had slipped slightly. Clara, Catherine said quietly, why don't you get us some coffee? Clara didn't move. Grandma should know the truth. Clara. Her voice sharpened, but my granddaughter held her ground. What truth? I asked calmly. Catherine inhaled slowly. Then she sat down across from me. For the first time since my stroke, her expression wasn't rehearsed. It was irritated. Telling her half stories isn't helping anyone, she said to Clara. Then she turned back to me. Mom, Daniel handled the financial side after your stroke. I didn't control everything. Interesting. A careful choice of words. Not, I didn't know. Just I didn't control it. And? I asked. And things got complicated, she said. How complicated? Catherine hesitated. Then Clara said the words that changed the temperature of the room. Grandma, Daniel invested a lot of the money. My eyes moved to her. Invested where? Clara swallowed. In some kind of biotech company. Biotech. That was not what I expected. And it's not going well, she added quietly. The lobby felt suddenly colder, because if Daniel had taken millions of dollars and pushed them into a desperate investment, then this wasn't just greed. This was something much more dangerous. I looked from Clara to Catherine. Neither of them spoke. Finally, I asked the question that had been waiting since the beginning. How much did he invest? Clara answered. Almost all of it. $4.1 million, gone into a single bet. I leaned back slowly in the chair. The story had just shifted again. Because theft is one thing, but gambling someone else's fortune on a collapsing biotech company? That kind of mistake destroys lives. And if Daniel had really done that, then somewhere out there was a company sitting on the other end of my stolen money, which meant the trail had just become much easier to follow. That night, I asked Lena to bring me my therapy schedule again, not because I cared about the exercises, but because I needed something to write on. She understood immediately. Good nurses and good allies learn to recognize quiet signals. She left the clipboard on my bedside table without asking questions. When the hallway finally went quiet, I turned on the small lamp and began writing 3 names. Daniel, Jonas Hallberg, biotech company. Then I drew a line between them. For 40 years, my work had revolved around risk. Contracts, acquisitions, property development, all of it came down to the same basic principle. Follow the money. Money always tells the truth eventually. The next morning, Lena arrived carrying 2 cups of tea instead of 1. That's either good news, I said, or very bad news. She closed the door quietly. My brother answered my question. I gestured for her to continue. He checked something in the banking system, she said carefully. Not officially, just curiosity. Of course. He found a transfer. My pulse slowed. How large? 2 million. That was already enough to make most people nervous, but not enough to explain everything. Where did it go? I asked. To a venture capital fund. I waited, focused on biotech startups. There it was. Daniel hadn't invested directly. He had moved the money through a fund, which meant two things. First, someone professional helped structure the investment. Second, the paper trail was likely layered. That fund, I said slowly. Does it have a name? Lena nodded. Nordvera Capital. The name rolled through my memory. Nordvera. I had heard it before, not recently, years ago. Then the memory clicked into place. Nordvera specialized in high-risk medical technology companies, experimental treatments, gene therapies, neurological research, the kind of investments that could multiply tenfold or disappear overnight. How much total? I asked. Lena hesitated. From what my brother could see, roughly 3.8 million moved through accounts connected to that fund. 3.8. So Clara had been right. Almost everything. And the rest? I asked. Luxury purchases, Lena said. I exhaled slowly. How many? A few large ones. She glanced at her notes. Vehicle purchases, travel expenses, jewelry. Of course, even gamblers reward themselves before the game ends. But something about the biotech angle still bothered me. Because Daniel wasn't stupid. Reckless, yes, but not stupid. You said Nordvera focuses on neurological research, I said. Yes. And my stroke was neurological, Lena finished. The room went quiet. Because suddenly, Daniel's decision looked less random. If he had invested in a company researching stroke treatments or brain recovery, then he might have believed he was making a brilliant move. Fix the family fortune, save the day, maybe even cure his mother along the way. But there was another possibility, a darker one. What company inside the fund received the investment? I asked. Lena shook her head. My brother couldn't see that level of detail. That was disappointing, but not fatal. Because venture funds always had investors, and investors always demanded updates. Somewhere out there, Daniel was receiving reports about the company currently holding my fortune, which meant sooner or later, he would need to talk about it. Later that afternoon, Clara returned. This time without Catherine. She slipped into the room quietly and closed the door behind her. I shouldn't stay long, she said. Mom thinks this is stressful for you. I've survived worse. She sat down beside the bed. Her hands were shaking slightly. Grandma, Uncle Daniel's investment isn't just any biotech company. My attention sharpened. What do you mean? Clara leaned closer. I heard Mom yelling about it last week. And? She said if the clinical trials fail, the whole company collapses. Clinical trials. That meant the company was already deep into development, which meant large amounts of money had already been spent. How soon will the trial results come out? I asked. Clara swallowed. Tomorrow. The word hung in the air. Tomorrow. Meaning Daniel's $4 million gamble was about to either explode into profit or vanish forever. I leaned back slowly against the pillow. For the first time since waking up from the stroke, I felt something unexpected. Not anger. Not fear. Anticipation. Because if Daniel's bet failed, then the money would be gone. But if it succeeded, then my children might be sitting on something far larger than $4 million. And suddenly, their behavior over the past 14 months started making a different kind of sense. I looked at Clara. Does your uncle know the results come out tomorrow? She nodded. Yes. I closed my eyes for a moment. Because somewhere out there, Daniel Ellison was waiting for news that could either destroy him or make him unimaginably rich. And if he was about to become rich using my money, then our next conversation was going to be very interesting. The results of Daniel's gamble were announced the next morning. I didn't hear it from him. Of course not. I heard it from Clara. She burst into my room just after 9, breathless from rushing through the corridors. Her cheeks were red from the cold outside, and she hadn't even taken off her coat. "Grandma," she said, closing the door behind her, "something just happened." I was sitting in the chair beside the window, slowly working my fingers around the handle of a porcelain teacup. Lena had insisted I practice fine motor control every morning. "What happened?" I asked. Clara lowered her voice. "The trial results came out." My grip tightened slightly on the cup. "And?" She stared at me. "Uncle Daniel's company. It worked." For a moment I said nothing. Outside the window, thin snow continued drifting through the gray morning air. Worked. That single word meant a great deal in the world of biotech. If a clinical trial succeeded, especially a neurological one, investors didn't just make money, they made fortunes. "How well did it work?" I asked calmly. Clara shook her head slowly, still trying to process it. "The stock price exploded this morning. Mom was screaming at Daniel on the phone. Something about the company being worth billions now. Billions." My $4 million suddenly felt like a very small seed. "Did Daniel sell his shares?" I asked. "I don't know." Clara hesitated. But Mom said something else. "What?" She said Daniel might have made over $40 million. The room went completely silent. 40 million. My children had told me I had nothing left. Meanwhile, one of them might now be sitting on 10 times my original fortune, using my money. Clara sank into the chair across from me. "I don't understand why they didn't just tell you," she said quietly. Oh, I understood. Perfectly. Because if Daniel suddenly admitted the investment had succeeded, then a very uncomfortable question would immediately appear. Whose money had funded it? Mine. And if the courts looked closely at that guardianship arrangement, well, things could become very unpleasant for him. Just then, my phone vibrated softly on the bedside table. The facility had issued it to me 2 days earlier for family communication. The screen lit up. "Unknown number," I answered. "Margaret Ellison speaking." There was a pause on the other end. Then a calm male voice said, "Mrs. Ellison, this is Jonas Hallberg." "Ah, right on schedule." "Good morning, Mr. Hallberg." "I understand you've regained consciousness," he said carefully. "Yes." Another pause. "I believe we need to discuss several financial matters." "I believe we do." His voice lowered slightly. "Your son made certain strategic decisions during your medical incapacity." Strategic. Such an elegant word for gambling someone else's fortune. "I'm aware," I said. "I also understand the investment performed well this morning." That caught him off guard. Silence. Then he said quietly, "Yes, very well." "How well?" Another pause. Then he answered, "The current valuation of your son's holdings is approximately $42 million. 42. I leaned back slowly in the chair, because the situation had just become much more complicated. Daniel hadn't destroyed my fortune. He had multiplied it 10 times over, which meant the legal battle ahead wasn't about recovering $4 million anymore. It was about something far larger, and people behave very differently when tens of millions are involved. "Mr. Hallberg?" I said calmly. "Yes?" "Tell me something." "Of course." Did my son ever inform you that the capital he invested belonged to me? The line went very quiet. When Halberg spoke again, his tone had changed. No, he said carefully. He did not. Interesting. Very interesting. Because that meant Daniel had misrepresented something important. Possibly something criminal. Then I suspect, I said quietly, that you and I will be speaking much more frequently in the near future. I believe you are correct. After the call ended, Clara stared at me. What was that about? I set the phone down slowly. Your uncle's investment. And? He made a great deal of money this morning. Her eyes widened. How much? $42 million. Clara nearly dropped her cup. 42? Yes. For a moment she looked almost excited. Then the realization hit her. Wait, but that money was yours. Exactly. I stood slowly, leaning on my cane. The stroke still pulled at my right side, but my balance was improving. Step by step, just like everything else. Because now the real question wasn't whether Daniel had stolen my fortune. The real question was far more interesting. What happens when someone steals $4 million from their mother and accidentally turns it into $42 million? All right. I need to pause here for a second. Imagine waking up from a stroke, being told you're broke, and then discovering the money secretly turned into $40 million. Would you demand it back immediately? Or would you wait and see what your children do next? I'm really curious what you'd do. The strange thing about $42 million is that it changes the air in the room, even if the money isn't physically there. You can feel it, like a storm forming somewhere beyond the horizon. Clara was still staring at me as if the number itself might explode. 42 million, she whispered again. Yes. But Uncle Daniel told everyone the investments failed. That's because, I said calmly, the truth would be inconvenient. She frowned. For who? For him. I walked slowly back toward the bed and sat down carefully. My legs still trembled after too many steps, but the strength was returning day by day. $42 million. Daniel had turned my fortune into something far larger than he ever expected. But that didn't mean he intended to share it. In fact, it meant the opposite. People lie much harder when the prize becomes enormous. Clara leaned forward. What are you going to do? Nothing, I said. Her eyebrows lifted. Nothing? Not yet. Because rushing into a confrontation would be the one mistake Daniel was probably hoping for. If I stormed into the situation now, he could panic, move money, hide assets, restructure accounts. $42 million could disappear into legal smoke very quickly. No. Patience had always been my best weapon. Grandma, Clara said carefully, there's something else. Go on. Mom doesn't know the full amount. I looked at her. What does she think? 20 million, maybe 25. Interesting. Daniel had even hidden the real profit from his own sister, which meant the situation inside the family was already unstable. Have they been arguing again? I asked. Clara nodded. Almost every night. About the company? About control, she said quietly. Control? Of course, because whoever controlled the shares controlled the money. Does Daniel own the shares directly? I asked. Clara shook her head. I don't think so. Mom said something about a holding company. A holding company. That explained Halberg's involvement. When you want to move millions quietly, you rarely hold them in your own name. You build structures, layers, shadows behind shadows. But even shadows leave footprints. My phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from Jonas Hallberg. I opened it. A single sentence appeared on the screen. We should meet privately. Your son is not aware I contacted you. I showed the message to Clara. Her eyes widened. Is that good? It might be very good. Why? Because Mr. Hallberg is protecting himself. And when financial professionals start protecting themselves, it usually means one thing. They've realized something about the situation could become dangerous. Clara tilted her head. Dangerous how? Legally. She swallowed. You think Uncle Daniel broke the law? I think, I said calmly, your uncle told several people a story that might not survive close inspection. Clara sat back slowly. But if the investment worked, wouldn't everyone just celebrate? I smiled faintly. Oh no, Clara. That's not how money works. Success doesn't erase the origin of the funds. If someone steals $4 million and turns it into 42, the law still calls it theft. And theft becomes much more interesting when multiplied by 10. Clara looked down at her hands. So, what happens next? I leaned back against the pillow and closed my eyes for a moment. In my mind, the board was becoming clearer. Daniel had the money. Catherine had suspicion. Hallberg had knowledge. And I had patience. When I opened my eyes again, I said quietly, Next, we let your uncle believe he's safe. Clara blinked. Why? Because people who believe they're safe. I picked up the teacup and took a slow sip. Make very expensive mistakes. Just then, the door opened. Catherine walked in. Her expression immediately shifted when she saw Clara sitting beside me. Oh, she said. I didn't realize you were here. Clara stood quickly. I was just leaving. Catherine watched her go, the tension between them almost visible in the air. Then she turned back to me. For the first time since my stroke, she didn't bother pretending warmth. Daniel told me you've been asking questions, she said. Yes. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You should be careful, Mom. Careful? You don't fully understand the situation. I met her gaze calmly. Then perhaps you should explain it. For a moment, Catherine hesitated. Then she said something that surprised me. You're not the only one Daniel lied to. That was new. What do you mean? I asked. Catherine crossed her arms. When you were unconscious, he convinced me the investment was small. How small? 500,000. 500,000. Daniel had lied to everyone, even his own sister. I only discovered the truth last week, she continued quietly. And what did you do? I confronted him. And? Catherine laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. He told me something very interesting. I waited. He said the money wasn't really yours anymore. My pulse slowed. What does that mean? Her eyes met mine. It means, she said carefully, Daniel believes he legally owns everything now. The room went very quiet, because if Daniel truly believed that, then he wasn't just hiding the money, he was preparing to keep it. And that meant the family conflict was about to become far more dangerous than simple greed. When Catherine left that afternoon, the room felt strangely heavier, not because of what she said, because of how she said it. Daniel believes he legally owns everything now. Those words didn't sound like speculation. They sounded like something Daniel had already explained to her, which meant somewhere in this carefully built structure of accounts, guardianship documents, and investment vehicles, Daniel had constructed a legal argument, and that was dangerous. Not because it was necessarily correct, but because a confident lie backed by paperwork can take years to untangle. That evening, Lena returned with my physical therapy chart. "You look like you're solving a puzzle," she said. "I am." She sat down beside the bed. "Good puzzle or bad puzzle?" "That depends," I said, "on how creative my son has been." I told her everything Catherine had just said. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, Lena folded her arms thoughtfully. "If Daniel believes the money is legally his," she said slowly, "then he must think the guardianship gave him full financial authority. That would be the obvious assumption. But authority to manage money isn't the same as authority to own it." "Exactly." Which meant Daniel was either bluffing or he had done something much more complicated. My phone vibrated again. Another message from Jonas Hallberg. This time it contained only an address, a private office building in central Stockholm, and a time. Tomorrow morning. I showed the message to Lena. "You're meeting him?" she asked. "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." She frowned slightly. "That man helped your son move millions of dollars." "Yes." "And now he wants a private meeting without your son knowing." "Yes." "That sounds risky." I smiled faintly. Not for me. Because men like Jonas Hallberg did not schedule secret meetings unless they were already worried. And worried people are very useful. The next morning, Clara arrived early with a coat and scarf. "You're really leaving the facility?" she asked. "For a few hours. Mom will lose her mind if she finds out. That's why she won't." We moved carefully through the lobby, Lena covering for us by telling the front desk I had a scheduled neurological follow-up appointment. Technically, not a lie. Just incomplete. The winter air outside hit my lungs like cold glass. For a moment, I simply stood there on the sidewalk, breathing. 14 months inside hospital rooms had a way of making the world feel unreal. Cars moved past. People hurried down the street. Life had continued perfectly fine while mine was paused. Clara helped me into a taxi. "Are you nervous?" she asked. "No." "Not even a little?" I considered the question. Then I said honestly, "I'm curious." 20 minutes later, we arrived at the address Hallberg had sent. A quiet office building near the harbor. Glass doors. Polished stone floors. The kind of place where money moved silently through invisible channels. Hallberg was waiting in a private conference room on the 3rd floor. When I entered, he stood immediately. Tall, precise, gray suit. Exactly the kind of man who understood how fortunes were built and hidden. "Mrs. Ellison," he said. "Mr. Hallberg." We sat across from each other. Clara waited outside in the reception area. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Hallberg opened a leather folder and slid a document across the table. "You should see this," he said. I looked down. At first glance, it appeared to be a standard investment structure. A holding company, a venture fund position, share allocations. But then I saw the name of the holding company. Ellison Recovery Holdings, AB. My eyes lifted slowly to Hallberg. "My son named a company after me." "Yes." "And he controls it?" Hallberg hesitated. "Technically, no." My pulse slowed. "What do you mean?" He tapped the signature section of the document. I followed his finger. There were 2 authorized signatories listed for the company. Daniel Ellison and Margaret Ellison. My signature was printed beneath the line, but I had never seen this document before, never signed it, never approved it. I looked up again. "That signature is forged." Hallberg nodded quietly. "Yes." The room fell silent. Because forgery involving tens of millions of dollars was not just unethical, it was criminal. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Halberg leaned back slightly. Because when the trial results were announced yesterday, the value of the shares increased dramatically. Yes. And when the value increased, he paused, the legal exposure increased as well. Of course. $42 million attracts attention. Lawyers, auditors, regulators. And when they began asking questions, someone like Halberg would need to protect himself. So you're telling me, I said calmly, that my son used a forged signature to create a company in my name and invest my money? Yes. And that company now holds approximately $42 million? Yes. I folded my hands slowly on the table. For the first time since this entire nightmare began. The path forward looked perfectly clear, because this was no longer a family disagreement. This was a crime. I looked at Halberg. Mr. Halberg. Yes? Does my son know you're showing me this? No. Good. I slid the document back toward him. Because I'd like to give Daniel a little more time to feel comfortable. Halberg studied me carefully. Comfortable? Yes. The faintest smile appeared at the corner of my mouth. People reveal their true intentions right before they believe they've won. And something told me. Daniel Ellison believed he had already won everything. The taxi ride back to the rehabilitation center felt longer than the one that brought me to Halberg's office. Not because of traffic, because now I knew exactly what Daniel had done. Forgery. $42 million sitting inside a company with my name on it. And my signature. A signature I had never written. Clara kept glancing at me from the other side of the seat. You're very quiet, she said. I'm thinking. About Uncle Daniel? Yes. She hesitated. Are you going to call the police? I looked out the window as the city slid past us. Gray buildings, thin winter sunlight, people walking their dogs along the harbor. No, I said. Not yet. Why not? Because Daniel hadn't finished making mistakes, and when someone forges a signature worth $42 million, you let them keep digging. By the time we returned to the facility, the lobby had filled with the quiet afternoon rhythm of visitors and nurses changing shifts. Catherine was already waiting. She stood near the reception desk with her arms crossed. The moment she saw me walking in with Clara, her eyes narrowed. Where were you? She asked immediately. Fresh air, I said. Her gaze moved from me to Clara. You took her outside? Clara stiffened. She wanted to leave the building for a while. Catherine turned back to me. You shouldn't be wandering around the city right now. I wasn't wandering, she exhaled sharply. You're pushing yourself too hard. No, I said calmly. I'm catching up. Something in my tone made her pause. We rode the elevator upstairs in silence. When we reached my room, Catherine closed the door behind us. Then she turned to face me. Daniel told me something else today, she said. Oh? He said you've been asking about the investment. Yes. Her eyes searched my face. Why? I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. Because I'm curious. Catherine studied me for a long moment. Then she said quietly, You're not as confused as Daniel thinks you are. No. A long silence followed. Finally, she walked to the window. You should understand something, she said. Daniel didn't start this alone. That caught my attention. What do you mean? She kept looking out the window. When you had the stroke, the doctors told us the damage was severe. Yes. They said the chances of you recovering mentally were extremely low. I said nothing. So Daniel started talking about protecting the family, she continued. Protecting how? He said if the business world realized you were incapacitated, people would start circling. Old competitors, investors, lawyers. That part wasn't entirely unreasonable. Power vacuums attract attention. And? I asked. He said the best thing to do was consolidate the money quickly. Into the investment. Yes. I watched her carefully. Did you agree with that? Catherine hesitated. I agreed that we needed control. Control, the word again. But you didn't know how much he invested, I said. No. How much did you think he used? 500,000. Daniel had lied to everyone, his sister, his wealth manager. Probably even the doctors. Catherine turned away from the window. You need to understand something else. What? He's not planning to give the money back. I assumed that. But it's worse than that. How? She took a slow breath. Daniel believes the guardianship gave him permanent authority over your financial decisions. That was an aggressive interpretation of the law. Meaning? I asked. Meaning he thinks he can decide how the 42 million gets used. Ah, so that was the plan. Daniel Ellison had convinced himself that turning my 4 million into 42 had somehow rewritten ownership. He didn't see himself as a thief. He saw himself as a brilliant strategist who had saved the family fortune, which meant one thing. He would eventually try to justify it. People like Daniel always do, and justification requires conversation. Right on cue, my phone vibrated on the bedside table. Daniel, calling. Catherine looked at the screen, then back at me. Well, she said quietly. Speak of the devil, I answered. Hello, Daniel. His voice sounded strangely calm. Mom. Yes? I hear you left the facility today. Briefly. I wish you'd told me. I didn't realize I needed permission. A pause. Then he said, There's something we need to discuss. I agree. Another pause. Are you alone? No, I said. Catherine is here. Good. Let him know that. Daniel exhaled slowly on the other end of the line. Fine, he said. Then I'll say this directly. I waited. The investment worked. I heard. The company is preparing a major acquisition offer next week. Interesting. That meant the valuation might climb even higher. And? I asked. And we need to decide what happens next. We. Such an optimistic word. What do you propose? I asked calmly. There was a long pause. Then Daniel said the sentence he had clearly been rehearsing. I think it's time we discuss transferring the company fully into my control. The room went completely silent. Catherine stared at me. Because now we both understood. Daniel wasn't just planning to keep the money. He was about to ask for permission to steal it permanently. For a few seconds after Daniel said those words, I simply listened to the quiet hum of the room. The soft buzz of the fluorescent lights, the distant sound of a cart rolling down the hallway, and Catherine's breathing beside me. Slow, tense, waiting, transferring the company fully into my control. Daniel had said it calmly, like a businessman proposing a merger, not like a son asking his mother to surrender $42 million. Daniel, I said finally. Yes? You want the company? Yes. And you believe it belongs to you? I believe I built it, he replied. Built it? Interesting choice of words. You invested the money, I said. I made the decision, he corrected. There it was, the core of Daniel's logic. In his mind, the moment he placed the bet, the money had become his. Daniel, Catherine said suddenly, stepping closer to the phone. What? You told me the investment was 500,000. A pause. That's not the point. It absolutely is the point. I did what had to be done, he snapped. The calm tone had cracked. Good, because pressure reveals truth. You used Mom's money, Catherine said. I multiplied Mom's money. You forged her signature, I added quietly. The silence that followed was enormous. Even Catherine looked shocked. Finally, Daniel spoke. How do you know about that? I've been doing some reading. Another pause. Then Daniel laughed softly, a dangerous sound. You spoke to Hallberg? Yes. I thought he might panic. Ah, so Daniel expected that. Interesting. He works for me, Daniel continued. No, I said calmly. He works for whoever keeps him out of prison. Catherine's eyes widened. Prison? She whispered. Daniel exhaled sharply. This is getting dramatic. Forgery involving tens of millions usually is. You're overreacting. No, I said. I'm being precise. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel's voice changed, softer, persuasive, the tone he used when negotiating. Mom, listen to me. I am. Yes, I moved the money without asking. Yes, I structured the company quickly. Yes, but look at the result. $42 million. I saved the family, he said. No, I replied quietly. You gambled. And I won. Catherine shook her head slowly. You lied to everyone. I protected everyone. You stole from Mom. I multiplied her fortune. His voice echoed through the phone now, and in that moment, the last illusion disappeared. Daniel truly believed he was the hero of this story. You wouldn't have done it, he continued. You're too cautious. Cautious people rarely commit fraud. This isn't fraud. You forged my signature. I created a company to protect your legacy. There it was again. Justification. People can rationalize almost anything if the profit is large enough. Daniel, I said calmly. Yes? Do you know what the interesting part of this situation is? What? You think the biggest issue here is money. A pause. But it isn't. Then what is? Control. Because Daniel believed control belonged to him now. But there was one small detail he had overlooked. Tell me something, I said. What? Have you actually checked the ownership structure of Ellison Recovery Holdings recently? The line went quiet. Then Daniel said slowly, Of course I have. Carefully? Another pause. Catherine looked at me, confused. What are you talking about? She whispered. I held up one finger. Wait. On the phone, Daniel sounded slightly less confident now. Yes, he said. Why? Because when you forged my signature, I replied calmly, you accidentally made a small mistake. What mistake? The company requires 2 active signatories. Yes. And both of them must approve any share transfer. Yes. You're one of them. Yes. And the other? I let the sentence hang for a moment. Is me. The silence on the phone stretched longer this time, because Daniel finally understood. $42 million might sit inside that company, but without my signature, he couldn't move a single share. Not one. Catherine stared at me. Wait, she said slowly. He can't access the money? Not without me. On the phone, Daniel spoke again, but now the confidence was gone. What are you saying? He asked carefully. I'm saying, I replied, that you built a very impressive fortune. Another pause. And now, I leaned back slightly against the pillow. You need my permission to touch it. Friends, this is the moment where everything flips. Imagine realizing the person you tried to cut out still holds the key to $40 million. If you were Margaret right now, would you negotiate with your son or walk away completely? Tell me honestly what you'd do. Daniel didn't hang up immediately. For several seconds, I could hear only his breathing through the phone. Slower now, measured. The way people breathe when they're trying to regain control of a conversation that just slipped through their hands. "So that's your plan?" he finally said. "My plan? You sit in a hospital bed and hold the money hostage?" Catherine folded her arms. "You forged her signature, Daniel. I saved the family. You gambled $4 million without telling anyone. And now it's $42 million. His voice cracked again. It wasn't anger this time. It was desperation. Because Daniel had just realized something terrifying. $42 million was sitting inside a company he could see but not touch. "Daniel," I said calmly. "Yes." "Do you know the most interesting part of this situation? I'm sure you're about to tell me. You think I'm angry about the money?" A pause. "But I'm not." That seemed to confuse him. "Then what do you want?" "Clarity." "Clarity?" "Yes. Because money reveals character faster than almost anything else in the world. And Daniel had revealed quite a lot already. You lied to your sister," I continued. "You forged my name. You convinced a court I would never recover. And then you built a company designed to remove me from my own fortune." "That's not what happened," he snapped. "It's exactly what happened." Catherine sat down slowly in the chair beside the bed. Her face had gone pale. "You told the court she'd never wake up," she whispered into the phone. Daniel didn't answer immediately. That silence was answer enough. "Daniel," she said quietly. "I did what the doctors told us," he replied defensively. "They said the damage was permanent." "So that gave you permission to erase her?" "I was protecting the future." Catherine laughed once, a sharp, bitter sound. "No," she said. "You were protecting yourself." On the other end of the phone, Daniel's breathing grew heavier. "Fine," he said. "Let's stop pretending this is about morality. Finally, honesty." "What do you want?" he asked. I leaned back against the pillow. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you understand what position you're in." Another pause. "You need my signature," I continued. "Yes. And I need the truth." "I've already told you the truth." "No," I said quietly. "You've told me the version that makes you look clever." Silence. "Tell me something, Daniel," I said. "What?" "Why did you lie to Catherine about the amount?" Across the room, Catherine lifted her eyes. "Good question." Daniel hesitated. Then he said slowly, "Because if the investment failed, I didn't want her to panic." "That's not the real reason." Another pause. "What do you think the reason is?" he asked. "Because you never planned to share the profit." The silence on the line became absolute, and Catherine closed her eyes. "Daniel," she whispered, "you said we were doing this for the family." "I was." "No," she said quietly. "You were doing it for yourself." Daniel didn't argue this time. Instead, he changed direction. "Mom," he said. "Yes?" "The acquisition offer comes next week. Halberg mentioned that. If the deal goes through, the company will be valued at nearly $60 million. 60. The number hung in the air like thunder. "And?" I asked. "And if you refuse to cooperate, the entire structure collapses." "Meaning?" "The investors will pull out," he said. "The company could implode. That would be unfortunate. For you, too." "Not really." Catherine looked confused. "What do you mean?" I turned to her. "Because the original $4 million was stolen." Daniel's voice sharpened. "Borrowed." "Stolen." "If the company collapses," I continued calmly, I lose money that was never legally invested. But if the company succeeds, I let the sentence hang. Then the profit becomes evidence. Evidence. Daniel understood immediately. Evidence of what? Catherine asked quietly. Fraud, I said. Forgery, financial misrepresentation, guardianship abuse. Every dollar Daniel had multiplied had made the situation worse for him legally, and now he knew it. Mom, he said carefully. Yes? You're not seriously thinking about destroying $60 million just to prove a point. I smiled faintly. Daniel? What? You still think this is about the money? Silence. But it isn't. Then what is it about? Trust. Because once trust disappears inside a family, no amount of money can buy it back. On the phone, Daniel spoke again. This time very quietly. So what's your offer? Ah, there it was. Not arrogance, not justification. Negotiation. Finally. I glanced at Catherine, then at the window where the late afternoon sun had begun sinking behind the buildings. Come see me tomorrow, I said. Here. At the facility. Daniel hesitated. Why? Because, I replied calmly, I'd like to see your face when we discuss the future of my $42 million. Daniel arrived the next morning at exactly 10. Of course he did. My son had always believed punctuality gave him control. Through the window, I watched his car pull into the facility parking lot. Dark green, sleek, unmistakable. The Aston Martin Clara had mentioned. It gleamed under the pale winter sun like a trophy. Clara was sitting beside my bed when he entered the room. Catherine stood near the window, arms crossed. Daniel closed the door behind him and looked at the three of us. For the first time since this entire story began, he didn't look confident. He looked tired. You've gathered an audience, he said. I prefer witnesses, I replied. He pulled a chair across from the bed and sat down. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Daniel leaned forward. Let's stop pretending this is a moral discussion, he said. Fine. You want control of the company? Yes. You have it? Yes. And you're threatening to destroy it unless I cooperate. That's not a threat, I said calmly. That's mathematics. He exhaled slowly. Then tell me what you want. Straight to negotiation. Good. First, I said, you admit the truth. To who? To Catherine. Daniel glanced at his sister. Her face was pale but steady. What truth? He asked. That you used my money without permission. I already said that. No, I replied. You justified it. That's not the same thing. Silence stretched across the room. Finally, Daniel looked at Catherine. Yes, he said quietly. I used Mom's money without asking. And the signature? She asked. His jaw tightened. Yes, he said again. I signed it. Catherine closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, something inside her expression had changed. The last thread of denial had snapped. Second, I continued, you return the original $4 million. Daniel frowned. That's impossible. Is it? The money is inside the company. Yes. But the shares are worth far more now. Exactly. Which meant selling a small portion of the shares would easily cover the original amount. Daniel understood that immediately. So you want your $4 million back, he said slowly. Yes. And what happens to the rest? The rest stays inside the company. His eyebrows lifted. You're letting me keep it? I didn't say that. Catherine leaned forward. Then what are you saying? I looked at both of them. I'm saying the company remains exactly as it is. Two signatories, Daniel and Margaret Ellison. every decision requiring both. Daniel stared at me. You want to be partners? Yes. With the person who forged your signature? Yes. Why? Because this wasn't about revenge, and it certainly wasn't about destroying $42 million. It was about something far more precise. Because, I said calmly, this way I can watch every move you make. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair. You don't trust me. No. That's not much of a partnership. It's not meant to be. Catherine looked between us. You're serious, she said quietly. Yes. Daniel rubbed his forehead. For a moment, he looked very much like the boy who used to sit at my kitchen table dismantling old radios. You'd really do this? He asked. Yes. Watch me forever? No. I shook my head slightly. Just long enough. Long enough for what? For you to decide what kind of man you want to be. The room went quiet. Outside the window, snow had started falling again. Daniel stared at the floor. Then he laughed softly. $42 million, he said. And you're turning it into a moral lesson. No, I replied. I'm turning it into accountability. Catherine stood slowly. What about me? She asked. I looked at her. You knew something was wrong. Yes, but you didn't ask enough questions. Her shoulders sank slightly. That's true. You'll receive a share of the profits, I said. Daniel looked up sharply. She will? Yes. How much? 10%. Catherine blinked. That's generous. No, I said quietly. It's a reminder. Of what? That silence has consequences too. Daniel looked between the two of us. So that's the deal, he said slowly. You get your $4 million back. We run the company together. And Catherine receives 10%. Yes. He considered it. Then he asked the only question that mattered. And if I refuse? I met his eyes calmly. Then tomorrow morning, I walk into a police station. The room fell completely silent. Forgery, guardianship fraud, financial misrepresentation, $42 million of evidence. Daniel knew exactly how that story would end. He leaned back in the chair and stared at the ceiling. For a long time, he didn't speak. Finally, he looked back at me. You planned all of this, he said. No. Then what did you plan? Very little. Then how did you end up controlling everything? I smiled faintly. Because, I said quietly, you forgot one very important thing. What? You assumed the stroke made me weak. Daniel held my gaze, and slowly. He nodded, because he finally understood. The game had never been about money. It had been about underestimating the wrong person. Daniel didn't answer immediately that morning. After I finished speaking, the room stayed quiet long enough that I could hear the faint ticking of the small wall clock above the door. 10 seconds. 20. 30. Clara shifted slightly in the chair by the window, but no one interrupted the silence. Daniel finally leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. When you had the stroke, he said slowly, the doctors told us you were gone. I didn't reply. They said your brain might keep the body alive, he continued, but the person we knew wasn't coming back. Catherine looked down at the floor. Daniel rubbed his hands together like he was trying to warm them. I sat in that hospital room for 3 days, he said quietly. 3 days watching machines breathe for you. His voice wasn't angry now, it was tired. And then the lawyers started calling, investors, old partners, people asking who was in charge now. That part I understood. Power attracts attention. Weakness attracts predators. So I made a decision, he said. Yes, I replied. You gambled. Yes, but not for the reason you think. I watched him carefully. Then why? Daniel looked up at me. Because I thought you were gone. The words hung in the room like a cold wind. And if you were gone, he continued, someone had to take control before the vultures arrived. Catherine shook her head slowly. That doesn't explain forging her signature. No, Daniel admitted. It explains the investment. He exhaled. But the forgery, that was fear. The honesty surprised even him. I didn't want the courts freezing everything, he said. I didn't want outside lawyers tearing the estate apart. So you took everything first, Catherine said quietly. Yes. And then you told everyone Mom was finished. I believed she was. I studied his face. Daniel had always been ambitious, but ambition and fear can look very similar when mixed together. So here we are, he said finally. Yes. $42 million sitting in a company neither of us can move without the other. Yes. And a mother who just threatened to send me to prison. I shrugged slightly. You forged my name. He laughed once under his breath. Fair. Another long pause passed between us. Outside the window, the snowfall had thickened, soft white flakes drifting across the gray sky. Daniel looked at Catherine. You're really taking 10%? Catherine hesitated. I didn't ask for it, but you'll take it. She met his gaze. Yes. Daniel nodded slowly. All right. Then he turned back to me. I'll return the $4 million. Good. And we run the company together. Yes. But there's one condition. I raised an eyebrow. Go on. You stop pretending this is just about trust. What do you mean? Daniel leaned back in the chair. You're curious about the company. He wasn't wrong. Biotech fascinated me long before this situation began. And if the acquisition offer next week goes through, he added, the valuation might reach $60 million, possibly higher. And you want to see where that goes, he finished. I smiled slightly. I always liked interesting investments. For the first time that morning, Daniel smiled too. Not a victorious smile, just a tired one. God help anyone who ever underestimates you, he said. Too late, I replied. Catherine let out a long breath and sat down beside the window. Clara looked between all of us like she was watching a storm slowly pass. So, that's it? She asked. No, I said. This is just the beginning. Because $42 million might have started this mess, but what came next would shape the rest of our lives. Daniel stood and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused. One more thing, he said. Yes? If that stroke hadn't happened, yes? None of this would exist. I thought about that for a moment. The money, the lies, the betrayal, the strange new company sitting at the center of everything. Then I nodded slowly. You're right. Daniel opened the door. And Mom? Yes. I'm glad you woke up. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he left. The room fell quiet again. Snow continued falling outside the window, covering the parking lot in a thin white layer. Life moving forward, whether we were ready or not. Well, that's the end of Margaret's story. I'll be honest with you. I'm still not sure I completely agree with her decision. Some people would have walked straight to the police after everything Daniel did. But she chose something different. Control instead of revenge. What would you have done in her place? Write it in the comments, and if stories like this keep you thinking, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you in the next one.